John had always dreamed of having a quiet place away from the busy city. After many years of hard work, he finally bought a big piece of land in the countryside. The land was peaceful and full of nature. There were tall trees, green grass, and birds singing in the morning. The best thing on his land was an old wooden barn. The barn was big and strong, built a long time ago by the family who owned the land before him. It was made of heavy wood and had a nice red color that made it stand out among the green fields. John loved that barn. It was not just a building to him. It was a special place where he kept his tools and fixed old things. Sometimes his children would come to visit and play in and around the barn. He would run in the fields, climb on the old wooden beams, and imagine adventures like cowboys and explorers. The barn held many happy memories for John and his family. Over time, the area around John's land changed. More people started to move into the countryside. New houses were built, and families came to live there. The quiet land was becoming a small neighborhood. The neighbors were friendly, and many shared the love of nature and peace. But as more houses appeared, they also wanted rules to keep the neighborhood clean and beautiful. One day, the neighbors talked about forming a homeowners association called an HOA for short. The HOA was a group of people who made rules for the neighborhood. These rules were to keep the area nice and safe for everyone. John thought it was a good idea at first. He believed that working together with his neighbors would make the neighborhood a better place to live. The HOA started to plan some big changes. They wanted to build a resort-style lake near the homes. The idea was to have a place where families could swim, fish, and enjoy nature. It sounded like a wonderful plan. John liked the idea of a lake nearby where his children and grandchildren could come and relax. For a while, everything seemed fine. The HOA held meetings where people talked about the rules and plans. John attended these meetings and shared his thoughts. He said he would keep taking care of his barn. He promised it would not cause problems. But he also wanted the barn to stay because it meant a lot to him. Then, things started to change. The new members of the HOA wanted the neighborhood to look perfect. They began to say that old buildings like John's barn were ugly and lowered the value of nearby homes. They wanted everyone to follow strict rules about how their houses and yards looked. John's barn, with its old wood and worn paint, did not fit into the new picture they wanted. John tried to explain that the barn was safe and still useful. He used it for many things, and it was part of the history of the land. But the HOA was not interested in history. They cared more about making the neighborhood look new and shiny. They told John he had to fix or remove the barn. John felt confused and sad. He had not done anything wrong. The barn was part of his life and family. He did small repairs and kept the barn clean, but the HOA said it was not enough. They sent letters demanding that the barn be torn down. They said it was against the rules of the neighborhood. John went to more meetings and talked to the HOA leaders. He asked if he could keep the barn if he painted it or fixed the broken parts. The HOA's answer was always no. They said the barn was not allowed and must be removed. John felt his heart break. How could something so important to him be taken away just because some people wanted things to look different? At the same time, the HOA worked hard on building the resort lake. They spent a lot of money digging and shaping the land to make a beautiful water area. John watched the progress and hoped the lake would bring happiness to the neighborhood. He imagined families fishing on the shore, kids swimming in the summer, and quiet evenings by the water. John tried to stay positive. He told his family that changes were coming, and sometimes it was hard to hold on to old things. But deep inside, he worried about what the future would bring. The barn was his link to the past, and he did not want to lose it. Neighbors began to take sides. Some supported John and believed the barn should stay. They said it was part of the community's story and gave the neighborhood character. Others agreed with the HOA, wanting a clean and new look for the area. The meetings became more tense, with voices raised and feelings hurt. John felt lonely. He was surrounded by people who cared more about rules than memories. But he kept his head high and continued to care for his land the best he could. He knew the barn was more than wood and nails. It was a symbol of hard work, family, and love. For the land, As the days passed, the conflict grew stronger. The HOA sent more letters, warnings, and even threats of fines if John did not follow their orders. The barn stood quietly through all this, silent witness to a fight between old and new. John wondered if the barn would survive the coming days. He hoped his neighbors would see the value of keeping history alive. But deep down, he knew this was more than just about a building. It was about respect, community, and finding a way to live together, even when people see things differently. While the lake was still being built, John held on to hope. He wanted the neighborhood to succeed, to have a place where people could come together. But he also wanted to protect the barn that had been part of his life for so long. This was the beginning of a difficult time for John. The peaceful life he had dreamed of was changing fast. The barn, the land, and the community he loved were facing challenges that would test everyone's patience and heart. John knew that whatever happened, he would stand strong. The barn meant too much to him to give up without a fight. And the story of the land, the lake, and the barn was only just beginning. ChatGPT said John's peaceful life was starting to change more and more. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, had grown stricter. At first, they only wanted small things to be neat like clean yards and painted fences. But now, they were making new rules about every building and structure on the properties, including John's beloved barn. John kept hearing complaints from some neighbors. They said the barn looked old and worn down. Some said it made the neighborhood look messy. These people believed that if the neighborhood looked perfect, the houses would be worth more money. For them, this was very important. The HOA leaders agreed with these neighbors. They said the barn was unsafe and ugly. Even though John knew the barn was strong and he took care of it, the HOA said it had to go. They sent John official letters, telling him to fix or remove the barn. The letters were firm and clear. If John did not obey, they warned he could be fined or face other penalties. John felt hurt. The barn was a part of his life and his family's history. It was built many years ago, and many family memories were tied to it. He remembered his father working in that barn and teaching him how to care for tools. The barn was a place where John's children had fun playing and learning about nature. To him, it was more than just wood and nails. It was a home for his memories. John wanted to find a way to keep the barn. He decided to make it look nicer to satisfy the HOA. He spent many weekends cleaning the barn, painted the old wood red, making it bright and fresh. He fixed the broken doors and windows. John also cut the grass around the barn and planted some flowers to make the area beautiful. After all this work, John went to the HOA meeting. He showed pictures of the barn and told the leaders about the repairs he had done. He hoped they would see how much effort he was putting into keeping the barn safe and nice. He asked if he could keep the barn now, but the HOA leaders were not convinced. They said the barn still did not meet their strict rules. According to them, the barn did not fit the style of the new neighborhood. They wanted everything to look modern and clean. The old barn did not match the vision they had for the community. John felt frustrated and sad. He did not understand why the HOA could not see the value of keeping the barn. He believed it was unfair to force him to remove something so important. The more he tried to explain, the more the HOA pushed back. The conflict made the neighborhood tense. Some neighbors were on John's side. They admired the barn and the history it represented. They said it gave the neighborhood character and reminded them of simpler times. Others agreed with the HOA. They wanted the neighborhood to look perfect and modern. These neighbors said old buildings like John's barn made the area look outdated. At community meetings, voices grew louder. Some people spoke kindly, trying to find a solution. Others were more aggressive, pushing for the barn's removal. John felt caught in the middle. He wanted peace, but the disagreements were growing. John also noticed that the HOA was spending a lot of money on the resort lake project. The lake was a big part of their plan for the neighborhood. They wanted it to be a beautiful place where families could swim, fish, and relax. John hoped the lake would bring the community together. However, the attention on the barn seemed to grow stronger as the lake project moved forward. The HOA was focused on making everything look perfect around the lake and nearby homes. They did not want any old buildings like John's barn to ruin. The View, John's family, tried to support him during this hard time. His children came to help paint the barn and clean the land. They understood how much the barn meant to their father. They joined him at the HOA meetings and spoke on his behalf. But even with their support, the HOA's position did not change. John began to feel alone. It seemed like the HOA cared more about rules and appearances than people and memories. Barn, which had stood strong for many years, was now a source of conflict and stress. John wondered if he would have to lose it after all. Despite everything, John refused to give up. He believed that there had to be a way to live peacefully with his neighbors and keep the barn. He talked to other people in the neighborhood who also had old buildings or special things that the HOA wanted to change. Together, they shared their stories and supported each other. John learned that many people felt the same way. They loved the community, but did not want to lose their history. The barn was more than just a building, it was a symbol of their roots and identity. John decided to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who wanted to keep their special places. As the weeks passed, John tried to find new ways to protect the barn. He reached out to local officials and experts for advice. He researched property laws and HOA rules. He wanted to understand his rights and find legal ways to save the barn. Meanwhile, the lake project was continuing. Heavy machines were digging and shaping the land. The HOA put up signs showing pictures of how beautiful the lake would be. Many neighbors were excited and hopeful. John was too, but he kept his worries about the barn close to his heart. The tension between John and the HOA grew, but John stayed calm and respectful. He knew that shouting or fighting would not help. Instead, he focused on talking with people and sharing his feelings. John wanted to remind his neighbors that the barn was not a problem, but a part of the neighborhood's story. John also thought about the future, wondered what would happen if the barn was removed. Would the neighborhood lose a piece of its soul? Would the lake really bring happiness? Or would the community miss the connection to its past? These questions stayed in his mind as the days went by. John's barn stood quietly through all of this, its red paint shining in the sun. It was a reminder of the hard work and love that had built the community before the new rules arrived. The barn waited to see if it could survive the changes or if it would be taken down. The story was far from over. John knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also believed in hope, in respect, and in the power of community. No matter what, John was ready to stand up for what he loved, for the barn and for the memories it held. Early one morning, John woke up to a noise he'd never wanted to hear. Heavy machines were working right on his property. The sound of crashing wood and metal filled the air. John rushed outside to see what was happening. His heart sank when he saw large trucks and workers tearing down his barn. The old building that had stood strong for so many years was being destroyed. John had not expected the demolition to start so suddenly. The HOA had sent him letters demanding the barn be removed, but John thought they would talk to him first. Instead, the workers had come early, without any warning. John tried to stop them, but the machines were too big and powerful. The barn was breaking apart piece by piece. Neighbors gathered around, watching in silence. Some looked sad and shook their heads. Others did not say anything. John felt like he was losing a part of himself. The barn was gone in a few hours, reduced to piles of wood and nails on the ground. It was hard to believe that such a strong and beautiful building could disappear so quickly. John's family came to comfort him. They helped clean up what was left and talked about the memories they had in the barn. Even though the barn was gone, the stories and love connected to it stayed alive in their hearts. The demolition did not bring peace, though. Soon, problems began with the HOA's big project, the resort lake. At first, the lake looked promising. The water was clear and calm. People were excited to have a place to swim, fish, and relax. The HOA had spent a lot of money and effort on the project. Everyone hoped it would be a wonderful addition to the neighborhood. But over time, the lake started to change. The water level began to drop. Mud showed on the edges, and plants around the lake began to die. The lake became smaller and less inviting. People stopped using it as much. Some said the lake was no longer clean or safe. John watched all this with a heavy heart. He remembered how much the barn had meant to the neighborhood. It had been a real useful part of the land. Now, the lake, which was supposed to bring joy, was turning into a mud pit. The HOA's dream of a perfect resort was fading. Neighbors began to complain. They said the HOA had not taken good care of the lake. The water was not flowing well, and the soil was drying out. The lake looked unhealthy and unpleasant. People who had once been excited about the lake now felt disappointed and frustrated. John spoke with his neighbors. Many shared his feelings. They missed the barn in the old ways. They wished the HOA had worked together with them instead of forcing decisions. The conflict over the barn was still fresh in their minds, and now the lake's problems made things worse. The HOA tried to fix the lake. They brought in experts and added water, but the problems continued. The mud grew thicker, and plants kept dying. Some families stopped coming to the lake. They no longer saw it as a place of peace and fun. John thought about what the barn had offered. It had been a stable and meaningful part of life. The lake, though new and shiny, was struggling to live up to expectations. This made John realize how important it was to balance change with respect for the past. The community was at a crossroads. Some people wanted to keep pushing for new developments, while others wanted to protect what was left of their history. John decided to take action again. He reached out to neighbors who felt the same way and formed a group to speak up for the community's needs. Together, they wrote letters to the HOA and local officials. They asked for better care of the lake and more respect for the people's feelings. They wanted to make the neighborhood a place where everyone felt heard and valued. John also shared his story with the media. He talked about the barn, the demolition, and the lake's problems. His story touched many people. Some were surprised by how quickly the barn had been destroyed and how the lake had turned to mud. The HOA faced pressure to change. They promised to listen more and improve their management. Slowly, work began to clean and restore the lake. It was a long process, but the community hoped for better days ahead. John knew the barn was gone forever, but he believed the neighborhood could still heal. He wanted the lake to become a place where children could play and families could gather. Again, it's more than that. He wanted neighbors to come together with respect and kindness. Through all the challenges, John learned valuable lessons. Change is not always easy, especially when it feels forced. But by working together and listening to one another, communities can find a way forward. John's barn was a symbol of his family's history and love for the land. The lake was a symbol of new dreams and hope. Both were important and both needed care and understanding. The story of the barn and the lake showed that progress is best when it honors the past. It taught John and his neighbors to value respect, patience, and community spirit. As the sun set over the muddy lake, John looked out and smiled softly. The road ahead was not simple, but he believed in the strength of his community. Together, they could build a future that included both old memories and new dreams. ChatGPT said. As time passed, the resort lake, once a source of excitement and hope, became a disappointment to many in the neighborhood. When the lake was first built, it was supposed to be a beautiful place where families could gather, relax, and enjoy nature. The HOA had poured money and effort into the project. There were plans for fishing, swimming, and picnics by the water. Everyone looked forward to sunny days by the lake. But the reality was different. Slowly, the water level in the lake began to fall. The edges of the lake revealed soft, sticky mud instead of clear water. Tall plants and reeds that had grown around the lake started to wilt and die. The water became murky and smelly in some places. It was no longer a place for fun and peace. Instead, it looked like a muddy pit. Many neighbors began to feel frustrated. They had believed the HOA's promises that the lake would be a great addition to their community. Instead, it was becoming a problem. Some neighbors stopped visiting the lake altogether. Others worried about the safety and cleanliness of the water. John watched this all with a heavy heart. He remembered how much joy the barn had brought to the neighborhood. It had been a real lasting part of the land, useful and full of memories. Now, the new lake, which was supposed to bring happiness, was turning into a place no one wanted to go. People talked quietly about the problems. Some blamed the HOA for poor planning and care. They said the lake was not built correctly, and the soil and water were not managed well. The HOA had not thought about nature's needs carefully. Others said the HOA only cared about appearances, not about what would really work in the long run. John joined these conversations. He listened to his neighbors and shared his own worries. Many agreed with him. They felt the loss of the barn deeply and now saw the lake as another example of the HOA's mistakes. The community was losing its sense of trust. The HOA tried to respond. They brought in experts to look at the lake and suggested adding more water or plants. But the problems were not easy to fix. The lake's water level kept dropping and the mud grew thicker. The plants kept dying. The lake was struggling to survive. John began to think about what had gone wrong. The barn had been a strong, useful building because it was built with care and had been part of the land for a long time. The lake, although new and shiny at first, was suffering because it had not been planned with enough respect for nature. The balance between human plans and natural needs had been lost. This made John believe that progress and change must be balanced with care for the past and for the environment. It was not enough to build new things quickly or to remove old things without thinking. Communities needed to grow with respect and patience. Feeling inspired to make a difference, John gathered neighbors who also felt unhappy with the lake and the way the HOA handled things. Together, they formed a group to speak up for the community. They wanted better care for the lake and more respect for everyone's feelings and memories. The group wrote letters to the HOA and to local government officials. They asked for a plan to restore the lake and for the HOA to listen more carefully to the people who lived there. They wanted to make sure the neighborhood was a place where everyone felt valued and heard. John also shared his story with local news reporters, talked about the barn, the sudden demolition, and the sad state of the lake. His story touched many people. Some were surprised to hear how quickly the barn had been destroyed without warning. Others were concerned about how the lake had turned into a muddy mess. With growing attention, the HOA faced pressure to improve. They promised to work harder to care for the lake and to communicate better with neighbors. New efforts began to clean and restore the lake. It was a slow process, but the community hoped the lake would become a beautiful place again. John knew the barn was gone forever, but he believed the neighborhood could heal from the losses. He hoped the lake would once again be a place where children could play, families could gather, and peace could return. More than that, John wished for neighbors to come together with kindness and understanding. Throughout all the challenges, John learned important lessons. Change is not always easy, especially when it is forced or sudden. But by working together, listening to one another, and respecting both the past and the future, communities can find a way forward. John's barn had been a symbol of hard work, family, and love for the land. The lake was a symbol of hope and new dreams. Both were important parts of the neighborhood's story. Both deserved care and respect. As the sun set over the slowly healing lake, John looked out and felt a quiet hope. The road ahead was not simple or easy, but he believed in the strength of his neighbors and community. Together, they could build a future that honored their memories and embraced new beginnings. ChatGPT said, John felt a deep sadness as he thought about his barn, now gone forever. It had been a part of his life for so long, holding memories of his family, laughter, and hard work. Losing it was like losing a piece of his heart. But John knew that sadness alone wouldn't help him or the community heal. He decided to focus on what he could do next. He began reaching out to neighbors who also felt unhappy with the way the HOA had treated the barn and managed the lake. A group of people came together. They called themselves the Neighborhood Care Group. Their goal was simple: to bring the community's voice back to the decision-making process and to make sure everyone's feelings were respected. The group started attending HOA meetings regularly. They spoke calmly and clearly, sharing their experiences and concerns. They asked the HOA leaders to listen more and work with the community, not just enforce rules without discussion. John explained how the barn had been a symbol of family and history. Others talked about the lake and how it could be saved with better care. HOA leaders began to realize that the community wanted to be part of the decisions. They agreed to slow down some projects and include neighbors in planning. The group helped create new ideas to restore the lake. They suggested planting more trees around it, fixing the water flow, and creating walking paths where families could enjoy nature safely. John felt hopeful again. Even though the barn was lost, the neighborhood was finding ways to heal. The group worked hard to bring neighbors together. They organized cleanup days by the lake, planting flowers and picking up trash. Families started coming back to the lake, enjoying small picnics and peaceful afternoons. One day, the HOA announced a plan to build a small memorial near the lake to honor the history of the area, including the barn that John had lost. It was a simple wooden plaque with a story about the barn and the people who had cared for it. John was touched by this gesture. It was a way to remember the past while moving forward. Through this journey, John learned important lessons about respect and community. He realized that change is part of life, but it must be balanced with care for history and people's feelings. Progress should not mean forgetting where we come from or the memories that shape us. John also saw how important it was to speak up and work together. When neighbors joined their voices, they could influence decisions and create a better place for everyone. He was proud of how the community came together after hard times. The resort lake, once a muddy pit, slowly started to look better. Water levels improved, plants grew again, and animals returned. Children played near the water, and neighbors greeted each other warmly during walks. The neighborhood began to feel alive and connected once more. John still missed his barn, but he was at peace knowing its story was not forgotten. The barn had been part of his family's history, and now it had become part of the community's story too. Together, they were building a neighborhood that respected the past and welcomed the future. As John looked out over the lake on a quiet evening, he smiled softly. The journey had been difficult, full of challenges and loss. But it had also brought new hope, friendship, and understanding. The barn might have been demolished, but the spirit it represented lived on in the hearts of everyone who cared. John believed that every community faces change. What matters is how people come together to face it with respect, kindness, and hope. That was the true strength of the neighborhood he loved.